Let's get started on Chapter 13, Active Directory and Installing Domain Controllers. In this chapter, we will look at the purpose of Active Directory. We will ask what is a domain and what is a domain controller. We will install and configure Active Directory, and we will look at Active Directory objects. We will look at creating a global catalog and running the DCDiag command. Active Directory is a database of objects, for example, usernames and passwords, or groups, or computers. The purpose of Active Directory is authentication. And when you install Active Directory on a server, that server is called a domain controller, or you could call it a login server, or you could call it an authentication server. A domain is an organization. A domain can be a company or an organization, which is typically defined as a logical group of people and equipment that work together for a common purpose. CCBC, for example, the Community College of Baltimore County, is a perfect example of a domain. So to install Active Directory, we have two steps. First, we install the Active Directory software, and then we create the domain. So to install Active Directory, we open Server Manager, and then we go to Manage, and we select Add Roles and Features. Under the Add Roles and Features wizard, we click on Next, and we select Role-Based or Feature-Based Installation, followed by Next. We will be installing Active Directory on this server right here, followed by Next. And then we click off on the checkbox that says Active Directory Domain Services. Now, we will not click off on DNS. We do need DNS, but we don't check off on it here. It's got to be checked off later. So we click on Next. It says these are additional features that are required for Active Directory. Do you want to install them? And we say yes. Then we click on Next, followed by Next, and we get a brief description that tells us Active Directory Domain Services stores information about users, computers, and other devices on the network. Things to note. You might want to have two domain controllers for fault tolerance. And Active Directory requires a DNS server in order to operate, and we will take care of that, followed by Next. We'll click on the checkbox that says Restart the destination server automatically if necessary. I click on Yes, then I click on Install, and then we can see Active Directory is installed on this server. And now we can see that Active Directory is installed on this server. Well, we have only installed it. Now we have to configure Active Directory. So we select the option that says Configuration Required for Active Directory, and we click on More. And then under the action that says Promote this server to a domain controller, we click on that option. And this takes us to the Active Directory Domain Services Configuration Wizard. We select the deployment operation, and we are not adding this domain controller to an existing organization. This is the first domain controller that is getting installed. So when you select Add New Forest, that means this is the very first domain controller that's being installed for this organization. And then we specify the domain information. Of course, this is very important. In our case, it would be ccbcmd.edu. Click on Next. Then we select the functional level of the New Forest and root domain. If we had old Windows 2003 servers installed and we needed backward compatibility, we would select a domain functional level of Windows Server 2003. But we're not using any old servers. It's all going to be Windows 2012 servers. Notice that it will install DNS for us. We did not need to make that selection. It saw that DNS was not installed, and it will install it for us. Then we type in the Directory Services Restore Mode password, and click on Next. We get an error message that says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Here's the problem. This is not the real CCBC MD server. This is just a test server that we're doing for this class. And what it's saying is it cannot contact the .edu server. Well, typically, if it were the real server, it would contact the .edu server. But since it's not, we will just ignore this error message and click on Next. Then it says verify the net BIOS name, which will be the same name, CCBC MD, followed by Next. And then it says, where do you want to store the Active Directory database? Typically, we install it on the C drive unless there's not enough space on the C drive, in which case you install it on the D drive, followed by Next. Now, before I click on Install, we have an option here that says View Script. And if I wanted to do this entire operation from the command line using PowerShell, I could put all of these command line commands into a single PowerShell script. But I'm not doing PowerShell right now. I'm just doing an install from the graphical user interface. I then click on Next, and it proceeds to install, and I get a green checkbox that says all prerequisite checks passed successfully. Click Install to begin installation. I see this little error message here, but I'll take care of it in a minute. Then I click on Install, and then it shows 3 warning messages because they're just yellow. It means they might be a problem, they might not. First, it says this is not going to be backwardly compatible with old NT4. We are not using old NT4, so it's not a problem. Then it says this computer has at least one physical adapter that does not have a static IP address. I know that I configured a static IP address for this computer for IP version 4. Well, the thing is, I didn't configure IP version 6 because we're not really using IP version 6. So what it's telling me is that the adapter does not have a static IP address for IP version 6. That's not a problem since we're using IP version 4. Then it says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because the authoritative parent zone cannot be found. And this is because this is not the real CCBC MD server. This is just a test server for this class. What it's trying to do is to hit the .edu server. So we click on Close, and the system shuts down, and then it reboots, and then I log in as the administrator, and if I go in to Server Manager, I can see that Active Directory has been successfully installed. After installing Active Directory, then you or I, as the administrator, then go and create user accounts. And then after we install Active Directory and after we create user accounts, then users can log in. And of course, that's the whole purpose of Active Directory. So Active Directory is a database of objects, such as usernames and passwords, or groups, or computers. And a domain controller is also called an authentication or a login server. The purpose of Active Directory is authentication. The way we install it is we select Add Roles in Server Manager. Now, let's talk about installing additional domain controllers. The reason you would install additional domain controllers is for fault tolerance and load distribution. If one domain controller crashes, that's okay. We have the other one right here to authenticate users. And load distribution means if you have a large number of people logging on at the same time, one domain controller could get them authenticated, but it might be a little bit slow. At the Social Security Administration, they have 7,000 people logging on at 9 o'clock in the morning, and one domain controller could get them authenticated, but it would be kind of slow. So you would get multiple domain controllers to make the login process just a little bit faster if you had a large number of users. Replication means that the contents of Active Directory is copied between the domain controllers, so they both have a copy of Active Directory. So if either one crashes, that's okay. We have the other one. Now let's discuss configuring the global catalog. A global catalog server is an index of all objects in all domains. So if you have a large organization with a large number of domains, such as the Internal Revenue Service, then that will eliminate the search of domain controllers one at a time. So if you have a large organization, you might want to install additional global catalog servers to speed the authentication process. So to make a server a global catalog server, we go into Server Manager, and under Tools we select Active Directory, Sites, and Services. And under Active Directory, Sites, and Services, we select Servers, and we select the server that we want to be a global catalog server. Under NT Directory Services Settings, we right-click and select Properties. And under the General tab, we click off on the checkbox that says Global Catalog, and that's all we have to do to make it a global catalog server. It says, "Are you sure?" And we say, yes, we are sure. And what that does is it makes authentication faster in a large organization that has a large number of domains. DCDiag is used for diagnosing problems with domain controllers. And if we look at TechNet, we can see that DCDiag analyzes the state of one or more domain controllers. So we run DCDiag from the command line. So let's go to the command line, and if we type DCDiag /?, that will give us the help screen, and it shows that DCDiag does directory server diagnosis. And in other words, our directory server is domain controller. It can test for DNS. It can test register in DNS, and that tests whether this directory server can register the directory server locator DNS records, because recall, Active Directory requires DNS. These records must be present in DNS in order for other computers to locate the domain controller. So I go to the command line and I type DCDiag followed by /test:"register in DNS /DNS domain /ccbcmd.edu, and the /v stands for verbose. And when I press the enter key, we can see that DNS configuration is sufficient to allow this domain controller to dynamically register the domain controller locator records, and the DNS configuration is sufficient to allow this computer to dynamically register the A records. So we can see that Active Directory and DNS are functioning properly, which is vital for users to be able to log on. DCDiag allows us to diagnose the domain controller. In summary, in this chapter we discussed Active Directory, and we saw that Active Directory is made up of objects such as users, computers, and the purpose of Active Directory is authentication. A domain is an organization, and a domain controller is the server that Active Directory is installed on. You could also call it an authentication server. We saw that Active Directory can be installed using Server Manager. Then we configured a global catalog server, which you might use in a very large organization, and we used DCDiag. And this concludes Chapter 13. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.